All right, gentlemen, welcome to the Strong Towns webcast. We're very happy to have the guys from Fate, Texas. One of the highlights of my Strong Town Summit in Tulsa this year was hearing you guys. You actually blew me away. I'm sitting there in the audience, and it was my session to sit in and kind of set up and make sure it ran smoothly. And you guys got up on stage and started presenting, and I said, wow, this is incredible. You had taken a little thing that I had written that I actually spent a lot of time on intellectually, but writing wise, it was kind of just an obscure, one post out of many. And you guys took it and did something really special and applicable with it. So we've been getting your presentation kind of hammered out there. People have been watching it and downloading it and taking a look at it. We wanted to have you on to go through it again live with our membership and live on the site for whoever wants to watch it, and then give people a chance to ask questions and kind of ping you on the ins and outs of what you've done and how it's worked and what some of the challenges are. I want to introduce the three of you. Michael Kovacs is the guy in the middle there. He's the city manager. You've been city manager for 3 years there in Fate and almost 20 years in government. On the left, as I'm looking at you, we've got Justin Weiss. He's the assistant city manager, oversees economic development, community development, public works, planning, takes out the garbage, and does all the computer work too, I think is what it is. And over on the right is a guy who I've told now gets an email or two a day from Strong Townsies asking him questions. Will Rugley is the Director of Planning and Development Services for Fate. Fate, Texas, welcome you guys. I'm so happy you're here.
Thank you, John.
I'm going to turn this over to you, and I'm going to take a back seat. I know you know how to share the screen because we worked on that a little bit earlier. Just a reminder to people watching, if you've got a question in the queue, just type it in the Q&A and we'll get to it at the end. So take it away, guys. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Chuck, and welcome everybody. We're very excited to have you here joining us. This is really exciting for us, something we've been working on over the past couple of years, and still it's a work in progress. So we feel honored that we've been invited back after our presentation in Tulsa to again go over some of the things that we've been doing here in the city of Fate. Hopefully everybody can see our screen here. We've got some slides prepared to share from, and we'll go ahead and jump right in. So the background and overview of what we're going to do today is very similar to what we did in Tulsa. We're going to discuss the city of Fate, give you an overview, provide some context to what we're doing and why we're doing it in the city of Fate. Next, we're going to discuss how we went about educating our community, specifically the elected officials and appointed officials. And afterwards, we're going to get into some of the nuts and bolts of doing math. And hopefully at that point, we'll have a lot of time left over, as this presentation has been made available on YouTube, to where we can also learn from you how we can better refine our process and give a little bit of an update as well from the last time that we presented. So, City of Fate, where are we? Who are we? That's my privilege to introduce our community. For those of you who don't know, the City of Fate is located just outside of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. We're about 30 minutes east of Dallas, if you can see that map in the top left corner there of the slide. We were noted as the third fastest growing city in the Dallas-Fort Worth area from 2010 to 2014, and arguably one of the still fastest growing cities in all of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. You can see there highlighted in that chart, we grew about 38.6% from between those years. And most recently, just this fiscal year, we've been having record-breaking month-to-month or month-over-month new home permits. So we're still growing at an extremely fast pace. Our community is comprised of several different neighborhoods. We're still working on a community identity. We have two incredible school districts that serve our community. We've got the Royse City ISD as well as the Rockwall ISD. This area is known for its family-friendly community, active neighborhoods, and of course the school district. So a lot of folks are choosing to live in Fate in close proximity to the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex because this is an area with strong economic indicators, strong jobs growth, and it's pretty affordable in this area for those folks that are commuting to the State Farms, the Toyota plants, and all of the different corporate relocations that are happening throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. Here's a slide that just gives a little bit of perspective to the growth that we're experiencing. Again, we're about a population 12,000 as it stands, so we're adding year over year approximately 1,000 people, and that's kind of on the low end. And that's probably in the next 10 years, with the number of lots that we have available throughout our community, we believe we will have this type of growth, barring any economic downturn, for the next 10 years. And so we will probably double our population at least another time within that 10-year period. Here's an example of one of the neighborhoods. This is a 5,000 home master plan community called Wood Creek. I think it's important to note and to give some context to our presentation that this community is also in what's called a municipal utility district, essentially a quasi-governmental entity that developers create in order to fund infrastructure. So all of the roads, the water lines, the sewer lines, everything to provide services to this community was through issuance of bonds by this quasi-governmental entity. And that's important to note because they, on top of the city's tax rate, also have a tax rate that the citizens have to pay. So when you think of affordability, cost to provide services, the city of Fate has an artificially low tax rate already built in because this utility district is within our city limits. So if they have a certain tax rate that is above what we as a city are already collecting, the citizens don't know one way or another. They just know it costs a lot of money to live in this community without recognizing that the city is not collecting nearly as much as the development Wood Creek is for the initial infrastructure that was put in. And we'll talk later how bad of a deal that is for any community, specifically ours in this case, where that doesn't factor in depreciation. We own those assets, if you want to call them, or future liabilities. We own that. And at some point in time, they're going to deteriorate to the point where they need to be replaced. And the MUD tax does not pay for that. Another community that we have here is called Williamsburg. This is approximately 1,700 lots. And similar to a MUD, this is a PID, Public Improvement District. Similar in structure, just a little bit different on the financing side, where there's an assessed value on the home, which the homeowners can pay off. But it essentially acts the same way in that the developer comes in, they issue bonds using the value of the community, and then they get paid back through a tax on the home value over a period of time. Another thing that we are embarking on, or actually kind of towards the tail end of, is our comprehensive plan and converting that into a unified development ordinance. Back in 2015, we underwent a year-long process. Actually, in 2015 is when it was adopted. We initiated the process before then. But it was about a year long of stakeholder engagement, citizen comments, getting the elected officials and appointed officials all part of a committee to discuss the vision of our community. And this planning document really becomes the framework by which we make our decisions as government employees. And so once you get the comprehensive plan adopted, you actually need to codify that or turn it into rules and regulation. And that's what we've been doing for the past 14 or so months, is turning it into what we call a unified development ordinance. Or in other words, the teeth by which we can create this vision and hold developers and the development community accountable to accomplishing that which is in our comprehensive plan. So that's a brief overview about the City of Fate, where we're at, where we're headed. I'm going to turn some time over to Michael, who's going to go through and explain the education process of how we went through the comprehensive plan and sprinkling strong towns throughout the entire process, and how we got to the point where we're now incorporating some of these principles into our day-to-day activities.
Okay, great. We'll talk a little bit about educating our community. And just a quick shout out to Kevin Shepard, who's working on our Unified Development Ordinance and our Park Dedication Fee Ordinance with Virginity. And he's one of the ones that gave us copies of Chuck's book to read. And once we read that, it all started to make sense. So 20 years of why doesn't my city have money even though we're developing and growing? All right, so let's talk about how we took a lot of this. We, of course, after we read a lot of information on Strongtown's website, and then of course checked it with a lot of other things, and looked at other people all around the country, looking at Smart Growth America and some other things. We decided that we really needed to get this in the hands of the policymakers. So we started educational efforts. This screen here is from an article that was done earlier that we were talking about how we shared our message. But essentially, yes, we talked to our planning commission. You know, we had a few meetings where we had a little bit of a lull in the action, which was perfect to do some educational formats. We actually watched the curbside chat with our planning commission and had about an hour-long debrief and talked about what we've seen, and it was a really great experience. One of those, actually two of those members are now council members. So the planning commission is a great place. It's one of the first places that the council looks to recruit new members, and whenever they place people on that board, they know that they're potentially making a council member. So we were definitely focused on them. They were the ones that were charged with implementing and overseeing our efforts with the comprehensive plan and the unified development ordinance. So then we talked to our city council members, and similarly, of course, we had a lot less time with the council, so we showed some short videos about some of our favorites, and talked a little about the different ones from the curbside chat. There's about 4 to 6 videos that Strongtown's kind of chopped up the curbside chat and kind of hit the high points, and we'll go kind of into some of those, some of our different favorite pieces. So this is one of the things. We also have done some education to our nearby cities, and we're starting to see changes in the behavior of our fellow cities, which is great to see. It's really, really good. They're reading our articles. We're trying to put a lot of information. We send things to them. This is a little chart that we got from Smart Growth America, and it talks a little bit about the municipal property tax yield per acre. And we essentially use that in combination with some other things like depreciation, looking at depreciation costs, which is something that we've read from our one of our local finance gurus, former finance person, Lewis McLean here in the Dallas area. But just trying to convey the message that kind of what we've been doing the last little while is not really working, but looking at more intense type development, but also balancing that with how much infrastructure you're going to need to put in. So this is something we had our intern Brent do at the University of North Texas, great public administration program. I'd like to thank them for educating him. And Brent, if you're out there, thanks, great job. This is a chart that we sent to fellow city managers. We sent them a white paper, essentially, a 2-page front and back little thing. And this is one of the graphs that we were highlighting, encouraging them to adopt more smart policies and how they're going about their business. And our neighbor to the west, the city of Rockwall, is undergoing a comprehensive plan this year. They've recently approved some high density development and making some pretty strategic choices, talking about making place, not just making anywhere USA. So we're really glad to see the sort of change taking place in the neighbors. This is one of the toughest things but everybody gets it. So if you're a government, you have cash accounting, and cash accounting is how the federal government works, how the state government works, how all the counties and the special districts and the cities, we all operate off this cash accounting. And it's good and it's bad. It's good because it's easy, but it's bad because it's not like a business. So a business, if you talk to any kind of business people, if we've got business people that are Strongtown members, you all can probably realize the horror of this is that if your price structure in your utility rates and in your tax rates do not account for depreciation of your assets, essentially, if you don't have a capital fund that you're putting money into every year, if you're not doing work out of your capital fund, replacing and updating your infrastructure as you go every year, then you're essentially running your system into the ground. And at some point, it's time to pay the piper. This is a slide actually that it's about a year old. It shows our utility fund depreciation annually. That's an annual cost factor. Our utility rates do not include that currently. Right now, we're actually undergoing a utility rate study where we're going to start with 10% of our annual depreciation into a capital fund. The only problem is that we just put a new water tower online, and these depreciation numbers do not include the new water tower. When you place the new water tower in there, it's over $1 million. So it gets harder every year. That's why when we talked to the council about this, we said, hey, we need to step up while we can, because before this number gets too large, it's time to start eating into it. And other cities have done this really well. Plano, a little city here in North Texas, very, very successful. They fund about 85% of their general fund depreciation into an account for capital replacement every year. And they do projects that are eligible for that, which would include street replacement and so forth. So we need to step that up. Carrollton, we also talked a little bit about asset management plans with the council. And this is something that if you really get into some deeper levels, that you just have to be careful that you don't get too deep, because you can create these studies and then you can really scare the political folks off because of the cost of implementing them. So this is something that actually Carrollton is using, and also a North Texas neighbor of ours. They've got 1980 subdivisions, and they're all about to enter replacement timelines. And they've got concrete pile replacements to do that are pretty significant. We've got some here ourselves, but it's really nothing compared to what they've got to do. So they're stepping their efforts up 2 to 2.5% a year on their capital replacement, and actually doing infrastructure replacement with that. And we've got a nearby city of Mesquite, Texas, also in the North Texas, Dallas area here, and they've got some innovation on how they're replacing concrete panels. Anybody who's in the public works, I'd encourage you to take a look at what Mesquite's doing. They're saving about half the price. They're doing it for about half the price, and they're doing it about half the time, which is great for residents, especially if your street's being torn up. So this was our favorite one ever. This is when we saw the part of the curbside chat about Taco John's, and this is where everybody really, the light bulb goes on, and you see the look in their eyes of, oh no. But talking about having to do the math, so the tax value and service costs per acre, looking at the Taco John's, of course, if you haven't seen this or read this article, Jordan then does the article, and then Chuck talks about it in curbside chat, and there's a video in the short series where he talks about the traditional development versus suburban development. So just showing people what the old blighted block brought in versus the new shiny thing across the street. And literally, this one is right across the street from one another. And of course, there's an economic development incentive deal for the new shiny thing, and it automatically makes the city poor right off the bat. Annexation and growth management. Whenever we present all these issues to political folks, you have to, that's just in their nature. They're problem solvers. So you have to give them you have to start giving them tools to address some of these issues. Additionally to the, looking to talk about, of course, the asset management plans, starting to set up the funds, but not just showing them the problems, but starting to work in solutions. So one of the things we talked about, and this is more specific to us, but going into the comprehensive plan implementation, trying to get our extraterritorial jurisdiction, our ETJ, under control. So that's annexations, which we're able to do here in Texas on a limited basis, but we are able to do that. And then, of course, starting a conversation with our neighbors. We've been continually doing that in Rockwall County, which is the smallest county in Texas. We cooperate really well together, and we constantly work together on everything from emergency services to other efforts. So we're in good shape, I think, and we'll continue those discussions with our fellow members, fellow cities. And then as we get into our budgets, we have to lead by example. So as we're considering new projects, we're always looking at what do the neighborhoods need, how can we prioritize reinvestment, how can we start getting our own capital budgets up, and starting to put away things like our capital replacement fund. That's actually going into our budget proposal this year. If everything goes well and everything still stays on track, we'll be creating our first general fund capital replacement fund. We'll be starting at 10% of our annual depreciation. So that means 90% we're still not covering, and of course we've got all those prior years of depreciation. So there's a bill already stacking up even on brand new infrastructure. So we're going to prioritize reinvestment in our subdivisions, and then doing real maintenance. This is something that kind of goes without saying, but you will be surprised as you look through city budgets how little cities spend on streets. It just seems to be too expensive, and there's just not enough value, and that's where we get into some of this education and trying to build sustainably to where we can start to balance some of that, what infrastructure we're putting in with what value we're trying to create with it. So this slide is fun because this street that you see here is a real street here in the city of Faith, and that street was recently repaved and has a brand new asphalt on it and some base repair. So that street, even though we don't have a picture of the new street there, that street was addressed in the fall. So we are starting to do real maintenance. Our council is excited about that. We've been gearing up for this. We've been working on how do we get to where we're spending the money that we need to spend. We're not just treading water in our city finances. And of course, capital replacement funds, it sometimes helps to kind of break it out for everybody to see kind of what functions. And this is all in your certified annual financial report. So the governmental accounting standards require that there's a supplement. Typically it's in the back somewhere. You have to kind of dig for it in the supplement, but there's a depreciating assets section in every governmental statement. So you can go take a look at where your city is or where your county is. And it's just a quick little tool. It's just a business tool. If you're operating a utility fund, for example, and you've got trash trucks and you've got sewer truck, different back trucks and so forth and so on. You've got all these assets that are mobile, but you've also got assets in the ground. So a quick little thing you should be doing a capital budget about what your depreciation is, or at least putting it in the bank. So that's something we break it out in funds. And then we did some unpopular things, righting the ship. We raised water rates. We sent a letter out to the citizens saying we've been implementing this plan for the last 3 years, and this is the final piece of our plan. We raised water rates 36% to stop the bleeding in our water utility fund. That fund is now cash flowing positive, and we're going to start addressing depreciation. So it's not popular, and something that also we need to really continue our educational efforts. We kind of went from the top down because we just didn't have time. We were doing our comprehensive plan, we were doing a code rewrite, we had to get the decision makers educated and on board as fast as possible. But one thing that they've talked to us about is they say, hey, we can't continue to do this as long as the public is not behind it and they don't understand what's happening. So do everything you can to educate the public. So that's something that we're stepping up our efforts through website improvements, through these kind of efforts, sending out direct mailings like you saw here. We're also doing some funny things like we're doing a power purchase co-op thing that the Fate power switch is something we've been working on. And we talk a little bit about in this letter, we try to route them to the Strongtown site to do a little bit more research about what's going on. And now that they've bought a suburban home, what they're kind of in for with the city of Fate. Justin.
All right, there we go.
Will, yeah.
Howdy, I'm Will, and yes, we are in Texas, and that's why I said howdy. We all say howdy. Last time we shared, I began by sharing how this particular idea has really started to change the conversation with our elected and appointed officials. Well, since Tulsa, I've actually taken it a step further. And so I want to share a short story about the recent developments in using this particular tool. And basically, I have meetings with what I affectionately refer to as our speculatives, which are our proverbial tire kickers. And I set up a meeting recently where the gist of the beginning of the meeting was such that how great this single family, everywhere suburban USA development was going to be for the city, the tax revenue it was going to generate, the sales tax dollars that would ultimately come as a result of this particular everywhere USA development. After the presentation that they provided, I actually decided to show them the analysis that we have been performing on the subdivisions throughout the city. And as I explained it to them, there was you could literally see them slowly but surely sinking back into their chairs. So it was it's also now begun to start changing the conversation with our speculatives. So what is it that I'm talking about in regards to the spreadsheets? This particular project is one that is downtown, an update from Tulsa. There was an old house on this particular piece of property that has since been removed. And I spoke with the applicant recently, and they are preparing to submit their plat to actually begin construction of this particular development. What you're seeing is a mixed-use development where along the right side of the page is retail along the bottom, and then apartments above. And then on the interior of the site is basically attached townhomes. So this is an infill site within our downtown area. So whenever we did the financial analysis associated with it, there's a few things that I wanted to point out. Number one, the current total annual tax revenue for the existing site. The existing site is $360.21. That's the tax revenue that's generated. The estimated tax revenue based off the development that is coming, every year it's anticipated that the city will receive $9,519. Sounds like a pretty good deal, right? Well, in our opinion, yes, it 100% is, because if you look down at the very bottom, or toward the bottom, where it says estimated years to repay public liabilities, the number of years there to repay the public assets or liabilities associated with this project is simply 9.5 years. Moving on to the typical suburban everywhere USA development, this is a subdivision in Fate that Mr. Weiss actually discussed in his portion of the presentation. This is a portion of Williamsburg, the PID project. So this, as you can tell, everyone's likely seen this type of development in their particular municipality. It's everywhere USA. So when we did the financial analysis associated with this one, the current total annual tax revenue is roughly $6,500. Once the build out is completed with this particular subdivision, the estimated total annual tax revenue is $490,000. Well, that's a rather big jump. And you say, wow, that is absolutely amazing. How could that possibly not make the city a fiscally solvent place? Well, if you compare the estimated number of years to repay those public liabilities to the previous example, what you'll see here is it actually takes approximately 32.5 years to repay that particular debt associated with the subdivision. So one of the things that we picked up from Strong Towns was coming up with the private to public investment ratio. On the left side of the screen, you'll see that it's 36-1 for the downtown projects, and then of course it's 11-1 for the typical suburban everywhere USA. And that's what we've kind of gleaned as a good measuring tool for the fiscal solvency of a particular community. And the bare minimum that we've also gleaned from Chuck and the Strong Towns website is originally it was anticipated that it was roughly a 40-1 ratio in order for it to be a productive place. But with further knowledge coming our way, we've just determined, at least preliminarily, that a 20-1 ratio is the bare minimum for that subdivision to be able to support itself in the long run. So I believe Mr. Kovacs would like to discuss this thing.
Sure. This is, of course, we'd like to give a shout out to Toby in Hays, Kansas. This is a piece from their citizen information guide that they use called the Stronger Hays. And so we've adapted that with also with the help of our intern Brent and Justin and a lot of other folks. This is actually a real neighborhood in Fate, and we haven't labeled it, but it's actually considered a pretty nice place. We you know, for being kind of anywhere, like we say, it's really nice. We've got great rock type facades. We've got a lot of our places have 3-car garage. Some of them are 3-story. We've got, like Justin mentioned, really great schools. It is a fantastic neighborhood, and people are moving here in droves because of the affordability and because it's where it is, location. And of course, we wanted to do bike paths and make it up, you know, cooler and do kind of cool development as well. So anyway, it's a great place. But here's some of the typical things we're seeing. Expenses. Here's the top graph there, 344,000 versus the tax revenue at 102. We still have to put in some, like Will was saying, we've got some other things we need to add in there. He'll talk a little bit later about kind of how we're developing our analysis. And we've got a neighborhood we're actually working on that we may talk a little bit later on too, about how we're working with the developer to get that up. But this is the kind of the citizen education piece. As we go back to, as we talk to our policymakers, and they've asked us, you know, we have the citizens educated. So we've got this informational piece. We're still waiting for the proper time to put it out there, and we're going to continue to refine our numbers. But this is kind of something that we did very early, just looking at property taxes versus the expenses. And the expenses are calculated. It's really easy. We just took the number of our general fund budget for our total general fund services, and we divided by the total number of homes in the city, and that's, you know, what it takes. And then we multiplied by the number of homes in this development, and then compared that. So that's our expenses, and then we looked at their actual. We went to the the Rockwall County Appraisal District and looked at home values, picked an average looking house. And we didn't go by house by house by house, but we picked an average house for that development we thought represented, checked it with a couple people that lived there, they'd agreed. And then we took that value multiplied by our very low tax rate and derived the tax revenue of just over 100,000. So as you can see, we're working on multifamily, what it costs to serve multifamily. Kevin Shepard is also looking at some of that and some other people around the country, what it really takes. Smart Growth America's done some studies, and the most they've come up with is 90%, but they've shown stuff as low as 30% of these type of numbers for a single family home. So density is cheaper to serve. It's also cheaper to run infrastructure too. So this is helping, I think, and it's helping provide us the cover that we're going to need to implement the Unified Development Ordinance, which is going to call for a lot of placemaking and density and some cool things while minimizing public investments.
Well, everybody, that concludes this portion of our presentation. Chuck, we'll turn the time back over to you. I understand there's going to be some questions, and hopefully we'll be able to answer a lot of those. But thank you.
All right. Yeah, I have like a ton of really difficult questions that are going to make you guys, wish you had never agreed to do this. No, I'm just kidding. You want to stop sharing your screen and we'll get us back on here. There's been a couple people who have submitted Q&A. Before we get to that, I'm going to give people a little bit more time. If you've got a specific question, go ahead and put it in the Q&A there on the bottom of your screen. I want to ask you guys a couple things. First, talk a little bit about working with the development community. When they come in and you start to talk to them about these ratios, you got to have a minimum of $20 of private investment for every $1 of public investment. How have those conversations gone? And do you have any tips for making them go easier?
I think Mr. Kovacs is probably the most suited.
Yeah, it's a challenge, and it's particularly a challenge for us because we want to launch some commercial growth, and we've got folks that just want to do the burger joints and the strip malls and the big box. So that is probably the hardest part. That's maybe a future. How do we crack that nut? We're still working on that one. Definitely on the home developer side, it's been a mixed bag. We've had people, as Will's mentioned, run away, try to leave the room as fast as they possibly can when they realize. We've had conversations with people and they say, well, if you're going to stick to this Unified Development Ordinance, if you're going to grade my future plats and zoning change requests by these kind of standards, I just need to know it's actual quote. I just need to know where I'm going to start buying land next. And of course, they're already looking at our neighboring communities because they realize they're going to run into, they're not going to run into the National Guard, they're going to run into the Highlander Regiment. So it's not going to be pretty. But yeah, as far as other people, we've had great, I'll give a shout out to Precept Development and Mr. James Mabry. We had a meeting with him yesterday, and our financial advisors were actually working on, these are the folks we talked a little bit about that we were working with a developer. And back just about a month or two ago at the Strongtown Summit, we were about 18-1 talking with this developer. So just like the parable of the sower, sometimes the seed falls on the good soil. So he's really taken the issue. Yeah, he's really taken this issue. He understands the plight of our mud districts. We looked at some various different ideas as far as how do we take some of these muds that, in fact, he's purchased one of these mud districts. He'll be developing Mud 8 in our city, which is going to be fantastic, beautiful homes. And we're looking at how do we make some of these changes. So we've worked with him over the last 2 months, and we've got the private to public ratio up to 34-1. And,
wow.
Yes, it's pretty interesting, and he's really taken this to heart. So, and he's saying, no, I'm not afraid of this, and I'm going to hit, give me some targets, and I'll hit them. I want to be able to say that this neighborhood is financially sustainable. So the neighborhood will probably, at this point on the draft, it will probably cash flow about positive 400,000 annually. It does fall off due to a really complex water contract that we have. Once our water contract, we actually hit a third pump station. So once we hit that third pump station need, we've got ground storage tanks, new pump stations, and we just hit another shelf. And as you're approaching this shelf, our current water contract is pretty profitable. If we add customers, we just have to kind of be careful. So typically, to have 1,000 residents for us, both on the utility and the general fund side, if you're buying citizens, it costs about $1 million for 1,000 citizens. So that's what it takes as far as expenses to run a very new city that doesn't have a lot of capital replacement. In this case, we're going to get about 3,000 citizens, and it's going to gross about 400,000 a year, and then it should drop off to about a break even, which for based on this current development is pretty good. The challenging news is in order to make it work, there's a lot of unique conditions that are going into this, and you've got to have really high, at this point, we've got very high home values. It's still very suburban feeling. It's got some sustainable attributes to it. We are going to have some high density housing near a school site, which is going to have some teacher housing and some public safety personnel housing. But it's largely going to be suburban, some urban farm stuff. But interesting neighborhood called Montara, and we're hoping it goes well. We are doing it as part of a settlement. We're part of a stay that we're allowed to talk about what we're doing and how we're progressing. So it looks like it's so sometimes it goes really well. So that one is going exceptionally well, and it's going to be very, very complicated. And the analysis has been, in fact, we'll send Chuck the updated spreadsheet. And Kevin's been watching this the whole way through with Unity and trying to give us some pointers as we go. We've actually attached Kevin at city expense. We've attached Kevin to Mr. Mabry and said, use your stormwater people and yourself, and use your engineering planning brain that you've got as an interesting combination, and give these folks some pointers, get them up there, help them with how they're designing their neighborhood. And the developers taken all that information from our consultant that we've attached to them and continued to make that neighborhood better and better. So sometimes it goes really well, and they take you up on it, and sometimes they just walk away.
Well, if you can cultivate that good set of developers, they'll become advocates for you too the next time someone wants to circumvent things. Let me, we've got 11 questions sitting here now. I want to ask this one from David Witham. He says, in your example, it looks like you're assuming 100% of tax revenue is going to pay for infrastructure build out in order to calculate the time to recoup the costs. Is that right? What about services like fire and police? Do you account for those in your model? Guys?
There's some bad news on that side. Will, why don't you? I'm gonna bring up something here to take a look at as far as cost per service unit, and Will can talk a little bit about using this kind of as an indicator.
So no, currently we do not right now. Obviously, we do have the average depreciation per unit that we build into the total annual cost to serve. But as far as going that in depth in the analysis, we have not yet gone that far. It's certainly worth considering and would obviously make the analysis much more, I don't want to, realistic isn't the right word, but it would probably give you a better idea or understanding of where a particular application in terms of a plat or a zoning request would end up in the long run. But currently, no, we do not incorporate those things. And again, like we mentioned in Tulsa, it's a new idea even to us, but we found it to be extremely effective, and therefore, up until at least this time, we've tried to keep it as simple as possible. That way it could reach the most people possible.
And I would add to that, I think it still provides an extremely powerful message to say that this number, the number of years that it costs to replace this infrastructure, does not even account for the yearly amount of money required to serve this population. So it absolutely, you could do it that way, to where you incorporate what are the annual costs to serve this, which is something we are absolutely open to doing. And in fact, I think in our Montara model, we even built that in. But again, to be able to say to elected officials, those that are making the decisions on whether to approve a development or not, or even communicating this back to the development community, to say, look, before we even make $1 on this development, we're having to save for 32 years every penny that we get from this development, just to be able to, at full build out, just to be able to repay or rebuild this infrastructure that ultimately will deteriorate and needs replacement. So you can look at it that way, or you can also look at it from that approach of explaining why it is that we're using that methodology.
One of the things that I found early on when I was doing my own kind of back of the envelope models was that nothing paid for itself. You know, when you started to get real aggressive and account for everything, I don't know if you guys have run up against that wall or not, but you know, how do you walk the line between being the sky is falling, nothing works, you know, let's just go home, and the people who actually are sitting there in the trenches trying to get things done?
It's tough. So in one neighborhood, so we've actually done, this is kind of the prototype stuff. So this right here is the crazy lab, and then Justin and Will make it work. So they're once we kind of work all the bugs out of some of the stuff that we're working on here, then they get to, we bless it and they can put it out more. But in this particular neighborhood, we've done a pretty aggressive job of trying to allocate costs to cost per service. So just reading one of the line items here, the property tax for this particular neighborhood at build out, they're going to generate $1.1 million in taxes, almost 1.2. Their cost for services based on the number of homes they've got and the typical service that we provide, which is not very robust. We have a very small parks budget, almost a mill street budget because all the streets are new, and we're starting to grapple with having to actually start street maintenance. So missing two huge components of what cities do, parks and streets, essentially. We're still going to, it's going to cost us 1.4 million to serve it, and that's with homes at 375,000 and up. So it's tough. There's sales tax we figured in here. There's franchise fees, which are significant in many states. So there's a lot of other things. We've included some water quote profits based on our water contracts. We've even tried to take the first life cycle. We do a first life cycle and a second life cycle analysis. We've tried to include all the things like the building permit fees, the impact fees,
one-time revenues.
One-time revenues. So if they're providing one-time revenues, account for that in the first life cycle cost. So I think it's helping that we're doing some of these type analysis, but it is true, like even wrestling with our really cool our model that we put out there with the folks with the dog park there on Main Street and the mixed use, trying to figure out what it costs to serve that development. If you were to pull out just a per unit, per city per unit, it's $1,300 a unit compared to the property taxes. It's nothing works. It's the same that you're coming up with.
Right.
But we know instinctively that it will. So I think as we're moving into this mixed use, trying to address what's the real cost to serve density, and we know it's going to be cheaper. So I think we just have to go back to you can get very, very complicated. We have to promote, you can't just promote no development. Obviously, we have to have development. We have to have smart development, as smart as we can get it. So get these ratios up, use some of the tools that we've got, and get folks to really think about how to minimize what they have to turn over to us for us to someday replace, and to maximize the amount of value while still being on the planning side, still being context sensitive. So I think we're going to accomplish that, and then it comes down to like what Chuck, you described in that article that we took and put into the Frankenstein laboratory, and coming around when you go to someone and say, hey, your property taxes haven't paid for your street. Surprise,
Right.
We're not sticking it in the bucket for someday we're going to fix your street. There is no money, and all your funds have been going to pay public safety and for parks and for all these things that you wanted, but there's no capital replacement funds. Now we're going to do the old-fashioned way, the way the old timers used to do stuff. We're going to assess you for the cost of your street. What are those people prepared to pay? And that's where we get into the person sitting around the table, just the exercise you've done in so many different places in so many different ways, and just trying to kind of rationalize, if it's above 20 to 1, people aren't going to walk away from that investment. They're going to roll their sleeves up, and they're going to.
Right.
I would add to what Michael just described, that your question was, how do we avoid this talk of doom and gloom, and it seems so terrible. Well, this is the reality that we're in, and everybody is going to be in a different situation. They have different circumstances. We have these entitled muds and PIDs, these entitled neighborhoods. We can't do anything about that. So we ask ourselves the question, what can we do with it? Because we cannot change what has already happened, what can we do next? What can we do now? So as we're analyzing these neighborhoods, even though they're entitled, we're still doing the math. We're still showing our elected officials so that when a new development, a new application comes in, they are already thinking, how can we make this better? Because we can't do anything about it, but what can we do with it?
Right. Tim Wright, and I think this is our good friend Tim from Shreveport, he said, what other documents besides the CAFR are publicly available that an average citizen needs to find some of these public to private investment ratios? Where are you guys getting that data, and where could the average citizen get it?
So the annual budget, the city's annual budget will break down your costs. So that's where we get a lot of our information as far as our cost to serve. The various tax records at the county office will talk about how many parcels and how many homes, how many businesses are there in the city. The planning department of the city typically has summaries of those too. And then, of course, comprehensive plan is a great document. Doesn't get into a lot of specifics, but it's a good overarching theme. I would recommend anybody, before they really get mixed up in their local affairs, really kind of dive into the comprehensive plan. If there hasn't been an update for a while, that's kind of an indicator that there's maybe some issues with that. And then, Will, what else do you suggest? I think those are the big ones.
The big thing is looking at the fiscal year budget on a continual basis, whatever the fiscal year is and whatever municipality you're located, wherever you might be located. Always take a look at the general fund budget, and that's how we've been able to come up with these estimated averages to plug into our analysis.
The tricky part though, Chuck, and for all of you that are on Strong Towns, is understanding what is the private investment. These are private developers that are spending their money, which is not open to really public inspection unless the public requires it. So part of our process now is requesting, as part of our ordinance and interpretation from the application administrator, which in this case is Will, we have determined that it is necessary for the good of our public to understand what our future liabilities are going to be. Now, granted, if they don't give you their costs to build that road, if they don't give you their costs to build that sewer, generally speaking, if you have an engineer on staff or you contract through an engineer, they can do that per linear foot. So we can generally estimate, but we like to ask of our development community these numbers up front. So they're providing us with their information, and that's where you get the ratio. We know what it costs to serve our community based off of our general fund information, but then we need to receive from them what are their costs in implementing this new infrastructure that they're giving to us.
Yeah. Paul Briseno is asking about the sales tax. He says in his city, property taxes account for less than a fourth of the general fund. Retail is the real driver. Talk a little bit about how the sales tax impacts this and how you would go about accounting for that. I know in Hayes, it's almost all sales tax, and they really struggle with it. You guys are a little bit different mix.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and jump on that one. So in the state of Texas, cities can receive up to 2% of gross sales as part of sales tax that they could receive. The way that the city of Fate is receiving sales tax right now is 1% to the general fund. And we have two special economic development corporations called a Municipal Development District and a Fate Development Corporation, which each receive 0.5%. Right now in the city of Fate, we really don't have much commercial or even sales tax producing commercial properties. So we still do account for that in our calculations by figuring out what the annual revenue is, sales tax revenue, and again, dividing it by the number of households. Now, that's a very rudimentary approach to it, but because we know of such few sales tax deriving companies within our community, we feel that it's a pretty pragmatic approach to determining how much more sales tax revenue are we going to get for every new home that gets here. Granted, once our 400 or 500 acres on the frontage road of a major interstate starts to develop, that's going to absolutely change because we're losing about $2 million, 2.5, maybe even $3 million a year in revenue to the city because all of our citizens are shopping outside of our community. So if we're able to capture, a larger percentage of that, that will absolutely change the dynamic of how we go about assessing these different developments that are coming to our community.
We do in the Montara analysis that we'll send to John. We do have a accounting for sales tax, and we just do, like Dustin said, we've got a very simple, how many homes in the city, what's our total estimated sales tax for the fiscal year 17, and then we apply the number of homes per household essentially. So we've got in that where we were talking about that neighborhood generating 1.15 million in property tax. If you calculate the sales tax that we anticipate from those citizens shopping nearby or online, we get a little piece of the online. It's super complicated. And go North Dakota, they're challenging the online sales tax stuff. So hopefully North Dakota is successful based on that'll trickle down to all the cities and the online shoppers. But we estimate $264,500 in sales tax from those roughly 1,100 homes. So it helps a little bit, but it's less than, for us, it's less than 20%. So I think the model like you're talking about, use whatever your local financing structure is. We also get franchise tax, and that's a big one for us. It's probably more than our sales tax even.
Yeah, when we were doing the work in Lafayette, I know the sales tax is really tough. We actually kind of tried to split it out by household between discretionary and non-discretionary. I mean, the idea that, okay, you're living in the city, you're going to buy toilet paper and toothpaste and, shoes, but you might go somewhere else to buy a car or something, that's a bigger ticket item, an iPod or what have you. So what percentage can we allocate to the property, the fact that it's a residence, and what can we allocate to a business in the sense that it's drawing from this larger market? And that was we spent hours on that. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Erwin Lowenstein asked, can you talk a little bit more about the strategies in your Unified Development Ordinance? He said you briefly mentioned density. Can you add more than that? What are some of your strategies that you're using to get that 20-to-1 gap?
So I could briefly hit on that. Some of the things that we're doing, basically whenever we did the comprehensive plan, what we realized is that we wanted to focus not all of our efforts, but the significant amount of our efforts in a few particular areas. So whenever we did the Unified Development Ordinance, which again is still ongoing, we decided to take specific attention and give specific focus to those particular areas. And we actually ended up coming up with unique codes for those areas. Again, not yet adopted, but confident that it will be, fingers crossed. And within those particular ordinances associated with those areas, there are a lot of flexible zoning tools that allow for organic growth over time. And then there's also a framework plan that we have set up through the UDO that basically says, okay, we've come up with this framework plan for this particular property. Mr. Developer, here's our framework plan. Follow this framework plan, and the process is essentially seamless. It's A to B to C to D, and then you're done. If you want to vary from this particular framework, then you got to come in. You got to do a 50-acre rework of this framework plan, so we can see how the changes that you're proposing not only affects your particular site, but affects the grand scheme overall. So that's one of the most effective ways we're going to be implementing it.
And then some of the more we've tried to use every tool at our disposal, but just the old-fashioned, trying to grow slow and smart. So we've got a northern area of our city that we've annexed in our comprehensive plan. We show as rural density, and if we're successful in essentially focusing growth into the core of our city around the interstate, we're going to build out these suburban neighborhoods. They're going to be awesome. And hopefully we're going to have enough revenue from the cool core over time to pay for the suburban neighborhoods that surround the core. But then we've got to keep our north area rural. So we've got tools to essentially to make that a reality. And it's tricky because there's just so much development pressure. But if you can imagine that, fast forward 20 years, fast forward 40 years, 60 years, 100 years, and everybody else, if they kind of disregard smart planning processes, you've got growth all around you. In the middle of Rockwall County, we've got this pretty unique and cool place that nothing else exists like it around, and it's financially viable. It was financially viable 100 years ago, and it's not going to be financially viable 100 years from now.
One other thought on that note is, how do you get that ratio up? Is require less infrastructure, right? So if they're designing roads that are 4-lane divided and it doesn't make sense, then tell them no, right? So now you're reducing the future liability for the city, which in turn increases the ratio of private-public investment. The other thing is, get creative with your infrastructure. Take a second look. Love engineers. You guys do a great job. You keep us safe. But there are some times where we over-engineer things. For example, on this same neighborhood.
Wait a sec. Did you just say we over-engineer things?
I'm sorry. Did I offend somebody out there?
What an apostasy. I can't believe you'd suggest such a thing.
So part of the sewer master plan required, thousands of linear feet to go up and around the community, pumping it and everything like that, where a quick fix where you could tie into an existing sewer line, maybe increasing some of the areas where it would bottleneck. And so you just save the city hundreds of thousands of dollars in both near-term and long-term money.
Actually, it is interesting because I do think the engineering profession, as I was taught it, is supposed to minimize costs and maximize the value. And it does seem a lot like the incentives are such that the more you build, the more you get paid. And it doesn't seem to me to be a stretch. You don't have to look, say the word corruption or anything like that to say there's a built incentive to just build more if you're an engineer. And I think cities have to be aware of that. We're up against the clock. Could I get you guys to answer two more questions? Would that work? Okay.
Sure, absolutely.
Kevin O'Halloran asks, how do you convince council members, which primarily represent suburbs, to support more urban and mixed use redevelopment that's not really in their districts? He says he's from Jacksonville, and it seems like, they kind of have to share the development equally, and they get these wins and they're just creating, bad development out on the edge. How do you get everybody on board?
It's a great question. So we're in a unique probably position that we don't have single member districts. So we don't have the district versus district things that other people sometimes deal with. And I've managed cities that also have those districts. And it's a little bit trickier, but I think in one of our big successes was basically saying, this is the financial turning point for the city. So we can either rise or we can fall depending on the decisions we make in the next few years. And our folks are unified by the belief that they want to, even though they are prepared to pay more taxes for really good things, they don't want to pay more taxes, and they get the economics. So coming from that kind of fiscal conservative viewpoint, they don't want to make their city any worse, and they're prepared to, in some cases, if it's a really, really nice apartment complex, if it's context sensitive, if it links to a walkable area. There is a zoning application for a apartment complex, and very kind of cool urban living kind of concept, and that was approved. And it was tricky. The neighborhood that it was next to came out and fought it, and we told them, hey, I think at some point you may well really want to live here. This is actually going to pay a lot more, and you show them the property tax of what this facility is going to pay in property taxes versus what the neighborhood pays. And one facility, just with a few acres and minimal infrastructure investment, it pays almost a quarter of the property tax for the entire neighborhood. So starting to show them some of those dollars and cents, it gets the wheels turning, and people just don't want to pay taxes for nothing. And we know that what we're doing is not working. We have to do some things different. So that was successful for us. For others, it could be better.
Show them relevant examples. One of the cities here in DFW that comes to mind is I apologize for it, but Garland. Garland's having a heck of a time keeping up with their infrastructure replacement. All the while, the neighborhoods are having a corresponding decline, not only in property values, but just the occupancy rates as well. So show them a relevant example of what their decision might ultimately look like.
All right, I got two more questions for you. One's a technical one, and one is a non-technical. The technical one comes from James Fogarty. When looking at public versus private investment, how would you suggest accounting for the differences between useful life of various public assets? Specifically, would you prorate a longer useful life item for a shorter cycle, or try to lump in several cycles for replacement for a shorter life asset to match the longest useful life in the system? We're talking about things that last different periods of time. And how did you guys go about trying to account for that? I can tell you how we did it in Lafayette, but I'd like to hear how you guys did it.
Yeah, no, that's in fact, that's one of the things that it's a footnote it's already in your financial statements. So the Governmental Accounting Standards Board has already wrestled with this, and in their quest to kind of daylight some of what's going on here, and actually GASB 34 just adopted just a few years ago does that. So they basically said, okay, city, you all are free to give a standard life for whatever you want to do. So typically the building is 40 years. Certain assets are 40. You can actually set in your own schedules, in your own accounting schedules, what those standards are, but you have to have them, and they have to be reflected in your financial statements. So actually, every city has already done that, every county, and it's all built into that. When you look in those the annual financial report, it's all in those depreciation numbers. It's all calculated. Now the multiple life cycles part that can kind of get tricky, but it does factor in for what is that asset useful for. And if it's let's say it's a water line, and you put 40 years on a water line, then at the end of 40 years, that asset's depreciated out. You might still get to use it for another 60 years, which I've actually done in other cities, but at some point, that water line's going to fail.
So for us and these calculations, we just did straight line depreciation on all improvements for 40 years.
We put in Lafayette, we try to put things into annualized cost.
Yep.
So in other words, if your road was going to last 30 years, but your pipe would last 50, we tried to put that in an annualized, essentially the idea of, okay, you might use debt for cash flow, but here's what you've got to produce revenue wise every year to maintain this stuff and keep it going. You might have something that you've got to borrow a little bit money, but you can amortize it over a longer period of time, and other things you can pay cash for. But yeah. All right. One last question, and I apologize. I've got 14 of them sitting here, but we're out of time. I'm going to do what I can to hopefully these things stay here and I can get back to them and maybe send a few of these to you guys. But someone named Kia, and I think the last name is Wilson. I don't know who. No, I thought it was a worthy question. So an insider question. She goes, what advice do you have for private citizens who want to encourage their local leaders to approach city finance the way that you guys are doing it? What would amongst the public help prod you to do this at city? What if you were looking out at the public saying, here's how you could support us, what would that be?
Great question.
I think every citizen that gets it is kind of a blessing and a curse to their city, because one strong citizen that puts all this stuff together and is able to influence one person coming up at public comment and dropping a bomb like this, one person coming up at a planning commission meeting and speaking when there's a public hearing about about how much private public investment and referencing some different information. You can kind of go about it a lot of different ways. There's definitely we're begging people to come to our public meetings. We just don't get a lot of, folks are busy. They don't have time for a lot of stuff, but show up for public hearings and dive into this stuff and get to know what the development is that people are proposing. It's going on all over the place every day. And show up for some of these planning commissions, meet the staff, and maybe see if you can talk to some of the staff members. I always like it when people come to me rather than my bosses. And for fellow city managers, if people know the manager, if you got someone who knows the manager, if you can get in to see the city manager, or at least refer them to some of this different material, and ask them to reach out to us or anybody else, their peers that are Strongtown members. As a last resort, you can set up a time and talk to your, you can talk to your council member, and they've got to listen to you. You elect them, you elect your mayor, and it's amazing, when people they just don't, no one ever looks at this. We're working with our financial advisor yesterday on this new concept neighborhood, and he sat back in his chair and he says, people don't go to the level of analysis that you guys go on this. They just do these developments and assume it all cash flows, but in the back of their minds, they know it doesn't. So this is just kind of helping reinforce with data what people already know and can see around them. They can see decline around them, and they can see big box turning into dead areas and so forth. Sorry. No, go ahead.
Going back to the downtown mixed use example, a lot of it's going to happen naturally per se as a result of whenever you send out zoning notifications. As part of that, there was like 30 people who either came to the meeting or came and spoke with me. And the fact of the matter is, most of them got it, and most of them really didn't care. But there was a few that I sat down with and showed them this information. They're like, well, it's not exactly what I want in my backyard, but I understand the reasoning for it, and it changed their opinion. They actually didn't show up at the public hearing. They understood it. So some people just aren't going to, you don't like things that you don't like.
Well, there's two paths divergent of woods, and you guys have taken the one less traveled, and you inspire me and inspire others. It's a hard thing to be a pioneer. They often are the ones that get killed crossing the difficult territory. I admire what you're doing, and look forward to getting further updates as you discover new things and run into new obstacles and try to figure this out. I always tell people there's no answers here. We're trying to do something that's never been done before. No continent has been completely redone in a generation the way we redid ours. And putting that back together with all the challenges that you face is overwhelming. So it's one thing for me to stand here and talk and write and be the armchair quarterback. It's a whole other thing for people like you actually having to make things work in the trenches to figure it out. So I deeply admire what you're doing, and thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Hey, thank you. And thanks. We still have over 50 people hanging on and a bunch more live streaming. So this is pretty engaging. I'll do the best I can to get the questions. Get the questions that I can back out, and we'll see if we can get some of those answered. But thanks everybody for tuning in, and keep doing what you can to build a strong town. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.